My name is Dilello, and the book I'm writing is Mosienko, the Man Who Caught Lightning in a Bottle. Writing about hockey history has always been probably like one of my biggest passions. This is actually my 7th book about hockey history in the last 7 or 8 years, so it's a big part of my life and something I'm very deeply focused on and passionate about. So I kind of work with the Manitoba Hockey Hall of Fame as their historian, and then through that, I'm always looking for new ideas to write about, to try to get maybe younger generations interested about the past, which is hard to do. But I just thought Mosienko was a name that has such a strong presence here in Manitoba and Winnipeg, especially still to this day. He was such a great hockey player, such a great person. His name's still people still know about the 3 goals in 21 seconds. So it seemed like something I really wanted to dig in deeper. And luckily, his family, he's got a pair of sons that are still alive, and they were on board. They were very helpful for me the whole way through. And it went really smoothly. It was a really fun project. I poured more research into this book and more, effort, more work than I've ever done before, like trying to dig and pull as much stories and information as I possibly could about this man. So I'm really, really proud of the final product I was able to put out. Yeah, so Bill Mosienko, first off, you just think of his skating. Every single, newspaper report, every, video footage I have, he was regarded as the fastest skater in hockey. That was kind of his thing. He was lightning fast, grew up in the north end of Winnipeg and just, skated for hours and hours and hours. And he started off actually in speed skating when he was, really young, and then he kind of transitioned to hockey. So I think that's where that kind of came from. He was, fast with a wicked shot, snap shot, wrist shot. He was, deadly, close to the crease. When he retired from hockey, I think he was ranked 7th all time to that point in goals scored, behind players like maybe Rocket Richard, Ted Lindsay. So he was, an offensive first line right winger, played 15 years in the NHL, all as a first line star, had a couple all-star game appearances, was named the first second team all-star a couple of times. So he, one of the strongest players of his generation from the 1940s and early 1950s. I was just surprised that a book on him already wasn't done for what the hockey career that he had. It's unbelievable. In the NHL, all was Chicago. Chicago brought him up in 1941, and he played there all the way till 1955. He retired from the NHL, and then he signed on to play with the Winnipeg Warriors in the WHL for the last 4 years and try to grow the game, more in Winnipeg, which he did to end his career. The area that he grew up in, the north end of Winnipeg, it's called, was it was all Russian, Ukrainian, Polish immigrants that had kind of come over. It was a poor neighborhood. It was by the railroad tracks, and a lot of these immigrants, they got jobs with the CPR, the Canadian Pacific Railway, and worked various jobs with that. And then the kids just got they joined in with what was other kids doing, like what the English kids were doing, or the French. They played hockey in the winter. It was what you did. Obviously they didn't play, the parents didn't play hockey back in Ukraine or wherever, but in Canada, they wanted to fit in. They wanted to have fun in the winter, and there was no video games or TV back then, so you went outside and played with your friends, and they got hockey teams. They played hockey in the winter, and they just I guess fell in love with the game. Mosienko and his brothers, they all played, and they made friends with their neighborhood friends and friends from other areas of Winnipeg, and they played against each other, and it was a really, really cool thing. I'm kind of jealous that I didn't grow up back then when you made your own fun, and now if my kids, they'll be playing video games or stuff, but back then, like I said, you made your own fun basically, and hockey in the winter was the #1 game, and stuff like soccer, baseball, football ruled in the summer. I don't know how to pronounce it, but the story kind of begins in what's now Dnipro, which used to be Ekaterinoslav back in the 1800s. So that was basically where Mosienko's father was from, and he grew up there. He met his wife Natalia, who was a native of Kishtowski, which I think is in Russia now. Anyways, they met and they got married in Katerinoslav, now Dnipro. And then Daniel worked on the shipyard at Sevastopol in the early 1900s. So he worked on a couple famous ships. He worked on the Kreuzer Ochakov and the steamer SS Johann Zlatust. They were warships with the Black Sea Fleet. I think eventually they wanted a better life, maybe in North America and Canada, and they were, they heard rumblings of prospects for a job, out there perhaps. So they left Sevastopol and they boarded a vessel. I believe it was called the SS Palanza of the Hamburg America Line in October of 1912 that took them across the Atlantic Ocean from Rotterdam, Netherlands to Canada. They went to Nova Scotia, and it was on that train ride that Mosienko's parents met the father of Alex Shibicki, who was another future NHL player, played the New York Rangers, won a Stanley Cup in 1940. So they were also emigrating to Canada, and it was Roman Shibicki, Alex's father, who befriended Daniel, Bill's dad, and told him, come to Winnipeg. There's a job. You can get a job with the railroad there, the CPR. There's land's cheap. It's a good spot. That's what I heard at least. And so they joined. That's how they went to Winnipeg, because they didn't know where they were going in Canada. They just thought they'd move for a better life, get a better job there, get land. But it was Alex Shibicki's father who pointed them in the direction of Winnipeg. First off, Bill Mosienko's son, Bill Jr., he was the most valuable resource, because he had already started putting together items, basically. Like when I the first time I went over to his house, he gave me a thumb drive that had 3,000 documents, photos, newspaper clippings, you name it. It had everything there to get me started. So it was basically from there, find some hole, fill the holes in, and then write it all out into a book. So that was amazing. And then conversations with him, his brother, other family members, of course. And then very early on, within the first couple months, I tried to interview as many of his former teammates and players that he played against in the NHL that were still alive, because there's not many left, and we're getting fewer and fewer. They get older, they pass away. So I tried to interview as many as I could. A couple, such as Howie Meeker and Johnny Peirson, have passed away since I interviewed them already. So it's it was timely to talk to them when I could. And then going through the archives was also very important. The NHLs, of course, the Hockey Hall of Fame was helpful in Toronto. They gave me some tips, some resources. Newspaper archives are important to every single book I write. The Winnipeg Free Press archives, the Winnipeg Tribune. And then for this book, I reached out. I got some stuff through the Chicago newspaper archives at that time. And then finally, I'm a member of the Society for International Hockey Research, and they have a very extensive database that's always very helpful. And I pulled some stuff from there, some stats. They're very good for statistics, dates, stuff like that. So basically, any resource I could find, I sought after and I tried to use. So I scoured the internet, for endless nights trying to find different stuff, different old articles. Just to try to, piece this together as best as I can. I wanted to tell Bill's story, to the best of my abilities, because I think, he deserves so much recognition. He deserves everything, So I thought I would, just do this for him. Yeah, the war was interesting because as soon as I think he was allowed to apply to join the army, it's kind of a gray area. We don't really know exactly what it was. Maybe because he was a hockey player, they kind of didn't want him maybe going to war or whatever. He was a smaller guy, but he also had a couple of medical defects that they, one thing in his foot, he couldn't fit into a normal pair of shoes. He wore a special pair of skates because he had a defect, I think, in his ankle and his foot. So I think that was charted on his notes. So he was considered, unfit to serve. Basically, he applied for 3 different, army things here in Winnipeg, and they all rejected his services. But he was also not allowed to travel to the U.S. Because it was during the war, so he wasn't allowed to go play with Chicago during the war unless they were playing in Canada. So Mosienko got a job in Quebec and played senior hockey there to stay sharp, but also work a wartime job to try to do his part during the war if he wasn't allowed to, go across seas. I wasn't aware of fully what kind of person he was. He was just, a guy who would do anything for anybody. He treated a homeless person the same way he would treat, a millionaire. It didn't matter, who the person was, stuff like that. Really makes you feel, good about doing something to commemorate someone like that. Regarding hockey, just what a great hockey player he was. No one said a bad word. Nobody that I talked to said a bad word about him, which is rare, because, if you talk to enough people, you'll find someone, that might say something somewhat negatively, but that never was the case with Mosienko. He was, world-class hockey player and a world-class guy. And that's, one of the big things I wanted to get across, in this book. Yeah, the Lady Byng Trophy in 1945 was a major accomplishment because back then they gave it to I guess they still do. They give it to the most gentlemanly player, and that season, Mosienko, he had no penalty minutes the whole season, while still, putting up, over a point per game in the stats column, which is rare, because when you're playing at that level and that speed, that intensity on a nightly basis, you're bound to do something to get some kind of infraction, take a penalty, and he didn't, which is crazy, but that was a big thing for Bill. He didn't believe in he didn't want to play the game super physical. He thought the game was a skill game, not a violence game. He was someone that spoke out against violence in hockey. He thought the game should be purely skill based. Sure, fighting's in hockey, but he wanted just to give the fans a good show them, nice stick handling, fast skating, good shots, good saves by goalies. So I think that was a big part of Bill's mold as a hockey player. And then, records, obviously the big one, his big record from 1952, the 3 goals in 21 seconds is that's probably the big reason why people still remember the name, because it gets mentioned so much on hockey broadcasts. When someone maybe scores 2 goals in a short period of time, they say, oh, he's close to Mosienko's record. But, after, 70 years, I think, around there, hasn't been touched. Hasn't really been all that close either for 3 goals in 21 seconds. So I think it's one of the best records in hockey, and one that, there's a good chance it never gets broken, in today's NHL. He wasn't a soft player by any means. If someone was, giving him crap on the ice, he would, dish it back. He wouldn't, back down. The Chicago Blackhawks also had a couple of, enforcers on their team, and, John Mariucci, Blackjack Stewart, and Bill's mentor, Joe Cooper, who kind of looked after the star players too. And if you mess with them, you had to deal with, the big guy. So with that, Bill, got a little more breathing room through that. But no, he wasn't a physical player, but if someone was coming at him, he would give it right back at you. Unfortunately, Chicago was always kind of in the cellar of the NHL in those years. Was not a strong NHL team. Their ownership, and they didn't have a lot of money to be spending on players, so they didn't really compete that well with the Torontos, the Montreals, who had dynasties in those years. So Bill played around 15 years in the NHL, and he only made the playoffs 4 times. The most notable was 1944, where they lost the Stanley Cup final to Montreal in 4 straight games. It was kind of not out of nowhere, but it was kind of maybe a bit of a surprise that Chicago made the final that year. And I think, Mosienko was not a rookie, but he was very young. I think at the time he thought, he would get, more chances at that, and, winning a Stanley Cup, but it never came. The closest after that, and really the only other time he made the playoffs in his career after 44, I think, was the 1953 where they had a very strong season, and they had a really, really good back and forth series with Montreal in the semifinal. They lost in 7 games, unfortunately, but they led 3-2. They had a lot of momentum in that series, and they could have won Game 6 if Montreal didn't make a goaltending change. That's the game that Jacques Plante came in and replaced Jerry McNeil, and that's kind of how Jacques Plante's career started, by winning that series, winning the cup, and then going on to a Hall of Fame career. So if the Habs coach Dick Irvin didn't make that change, Chicago probably wins that series, and probably might win the Stanley Cup, because Boston had upset Detroit in the other semifinal, who were also kind of an underdog. So it would have been 2 underdogs playing off for the cup. But that's a what if would have happened. But it would be interesting, that's for sure. There's a little bit. YouTube has some clips of him playing. They have a clip of him at his bowling alley in Winnipeg. So YouTube does have some clips of him playing. The Hockey Hall of Fame in their archives, they have some old Chicago games too. So there's footage there. It's not for public. It's not on the public domain, but it can be found privately if you search it out, which I did. So I have some good clips of Mosienko, his fast skating, his great shot, him scoring some goals, him leading Chicago, being one of the lone bright spots, through a darker time, I guess, for their franchise. Absolutely, I think it was a source of pride. For Mosienko was always, very, very proud of his Ukrainian heritage. And in Winnipeg, being from Winnipeg, we have so many. We have such a big Ukrainian population here in Winnipeg. We have Ukrainian churches. We had a Ukrainian athletic club. That Bill was in that area. So they had a newspaper, a Ukrainian newspaper here in Winnipeg. So in that newspaper, it would show Bill Mosienko's doing well for Chicago. Bill Juzda's doing good for Toronto. Terry Sawchuk has another shutout in Detroit. So they would update the readers, and the Ukrainian population here in Winnipeg would keep track of how these NHL players were doing that had Ukrainian heritage, and they would cheer them on. It was a very great sense of pride, I think, for Bill. Bill was always, like I said, very proud of his Ukrainian heritage, and it was very important to him, and it was very important to the community that someone from their descent went on to great things, and not just Bill, like I said, there were so many. So yeah, I think everybody was very proud of them, that's for sure. It seems almost there's more and more hockey books coming out every year. So there's lots of competition, to get readers, reading something, which is a good thing. This is probably one of the first for, I guess, the Chicago Blackhawks. Here in Canada, the Montreal Canadiens and the Toronto Maple Leafs of the 40s and before are very heavily covered. They're researched. There's biographies on Howie Morenz, Maurice Richard, that kind of thing, and Toronto's players as well. But if you look to the U.S. teams, Chicago and Detroit, and the Rangers, I guess, even Boston, there's not a whole ton of biographies on players pre-1960 that played in the 60s. So, something like this, writing about Bill Mosienko, like I said, hadn't been done before. So I jumped at that. A few years back, I wrote a biography on Boston's goalie, Frank Brimsek, that I was surprised nothing had been done. He played in the 30s and 40s, so I did that. But yeah, there's books on the time period and teams, but to get in depth on somebody's life, for players from this time period, it's rare. There's a couple of really good books, out there on players, but they're mainly Toronto or Montreal, for the Canadian fan bases and stuff. So there's not a whole ton of biographies on players that just played for U.S. teams in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. So that wasn't something that I maybe consciously thought about when I was writing the book, that I was doing something. But now talking about it, it seems like a pretty cool thing too. I always have something on the go. Coming up next, I'm working on a biography on Ab McDonald, who was another great ambassador for the game here in Winnipeg. He won 4 Stanley Cups in his first 4 seasons in the late 50s and early 60s. He was a good, lifelong ambassador for the game of hockey in Winnipeg. So I'm going to be doing that with the help of his family. I knew Ab a little bit in the years before he passed away. He came out to one of my book signings and signed books with me, which is really cool. So I really look forward to doing that. And then I'm doing another project on the NHL's first expansion era from, I think, 1924 to 1946, and just talking about the way the NHL was back then, kind of going in depth with some stories about certain players, certain, teams from that era, teams that are now defunct, like the Montreal Maroons, New York Americans, etc. So nothing really has been done in that era for like just a broad NHL history. So I look to tackle that. And then who knows, I have maybe a historical fiction book idea for hockey in World War II and something there that I'm kind of toying with. So we'll see what happens. I'm 27 right now, and I kind of have a goal to write 10 books by the time I'm 30. So I gotta keep writing, I guess, and pump some more books out. Like, not even the players too, the goalies. The goalies look like stick men compared to like what they are today. They didn't wear masks. If they got hit in the face, they'd be out with a concussion. But there was no backup goalies, so they would get stitched up and they'd get thrown back out there. It was the Wild West. It seemed like it was. You had to be really tough to play in the NHL back then, because you get injured like very, very easily. Like I'm looking right now at photos of like Mosienko's equipment. It wouldn't be as, it's okay, but it's nothing like the players wear today. Like players now are so much more protected. Bill actually did wear a helmet when he first joined the NHL because his mom wanted him to wear one to be safe, in the big league. So he did wear a helmet for his first season or two in the NHL, before eventually, discarding it. I don't know for what reason, maybe just because he felt more comfortable. But yeah, helmets were, a rarity until the 1970s, 80s. Like it seemed like a pretty simple thing to do. At least the goalies started wearing masks in the, late 50s, early 60s. Because I can't imagine, facing a 100-mile-an-hour slap shot and taking it in the nose or the forehead. It would probably knock me out. I did go in depth as well in my research with Bill's line mates. Bill played on the pony line, which was, the highest scoring line of their time. Like they outscored even the famous punch line in Montreal with Toe Blake, Elmer Locke, and Maurice Richard. So the pony line was Bill at right wing with Max Bentley at center and brother Doug Bentley at left wing. And those brothers came from a town called Dilello, which was about half an hour outside of Saskatoon in Saskatchewan. So for this book, last summer I drove, 9 hours from Winnipeg to Dilello, and I stayed at Max Bentley's son's house. We went golfing a couple times, which was awesome. And, he shared, his family's stories, his dad's, memories of Bill, just stories that were passed down to them. So there's a whole chapter in the Mosienko book, it's called Dilello, and it tells the Bentley story as well because, the three of them were all lifelong friends. They had so many, great memories together, and they were so highly successful as a line that I really wanted to get not just Bill's story, but the pony line story out there to readers, because I know they still have fans today too. No, thank you for reaching out. It's cool that someone I didn't expect to be getting any people that want to talk with the book yet until it was out. So I really think this will help get people interested. I'll definitely share it with my publisher and on my social media channels. And hopefully people learn a couple things and maybe want to read the whole book. That'd be nice. And I look forward to the book coming out in October. I think it's going to be great here in Winnipeg. Take care, man.